Donald Trump also defied the pollsters once again. The pollsters missed the mark once again. How did that happen? What's broken? Can pollsters figure this out? You see the results of today being the third consecutive presidential election in which those tasked with measuring the mood of the American people failed to capture the truth. They failed to see that Donald Trump still had a massive following. They had given the lead to Kamala Harris, remember, saying till a day before election day that the race was neck and neck. You must have heard that term over and over again. Clearly, the race was never neck and neck. Trump has massive support. All across the battlegrounds in the Rust Belt, Sun Belt, both tied races in pre-election polls turned into decisive victories for Donald Trump. Kamala Harris's supposed strength in Iowa was not real, apparently. Suggestions that Trump's support had faded with black voters in Georgia and North Carolina were also not right. Latino voters also swung hard to the right, even though a year of surveys suggested conflicting results. A 2 or 3 point overall miss across the board is not abnormal after all. But this year's result was neither as surprising as 2016 nor as big of a mathematical miss as 2020. According to American news reports, pollsters had retooled their methods after 2016. They did the same in 2020, but to be wrong a third time, that does raise serious questions about the pollsters' ability to measure Trump's support. Take the election's most prominent polls, for example. From the New York Times and Siena College, the final New York Times-Siena swing state surveys, remember, showed small Harris leads in Nevada and Wisconsin. But look at the results. Trump won Wisconsin and Nevada. They showed tied races in Georgia, North Carolina, Pennsylvania. Trump won them all. So this does raise big questions about the surveys. Who is conducting them? Why are they so off? Experts attribute this to several factors. Pollsters say that for decades, they have been dealing with a crisis of falling response rates. They say that polls are only as good as their sample. The wider the sample, the better the data. During the era of phone calls, it was easier for pollsters to basically get an understanding of the voter sentiment. Today, with technological advancement and changes like caller IDs, the rise of texting, the rise of spam messages, few people pick up their phones or answer unprompted text messages. In fact, even the well-respected New York Times Siena College poll gets around a 1% response rate. That cannot be a sample in order to decide an entire country's viewpoint. And to counter that, pollsters are relying on more and more complex modeling, like using key variables like age, race, gender, political affiliation. And this allows the pollsters, in theory, to extrapolate as much information about the general voting population as they can. But it's still data coming from a handful of responses, after all. Sure, pollsters are making good faith decisions about how to stretch and compress the data into the shape of the voting electorate. But you see, these are still educated guesses and reasonable minds may differ. There are many factors that still do not get accounted for. And one major section of the people being the undecided voters, the hidden vote. We told you about that. Who did they vote for eventually? What made them change their mind, if at all? Should the pollsters be blamed for the hidden voters? These are important questions to be asked. After all, they are a staple of pre-election media coverage and post-election scrutiny and analysis. They drive news cycles. They drive campaign strategies. They can influence the decisions of potential donors as well as voters. They are also growing more and more precarious, to say the least. Going straight across now to our correspondent Susan Teherani with us from Times Square in New York. Hi, Susan. What a day it's been, really. I want to first ask you for your assessment of the reaction that we've seen coming in regarding these polls. Serious questions, like we said at this point, about how they got it so wrong.
Well, Well, Molly, I'd like to go on record and say that we on WION always cautioned our viewers to not trust the polls because of what we saw in 2020, 2016, and 2022.
Yes.
You know, there is one thing to have really big margins in polls. It's another thing to have someone like Kamala Harris and Donald Trump go neck and neck. When you see Donald Trump with someone neck and neck, it usually means that Donald Trump is outperforming. And I think that was the quiet part that no one wanted to say out loud. But, you know, it is what it is. There's a lot of issues with the polling. It's not that it's sinister. It's just, first of all, because Donald Trump supporters have been chastised so much in the United States, a lot of them don't talk to pollsters. They're not honest with who they're going to vote for. And then on the other hand, a lot of these polls, when you look at them, when they go into the margin of error, it really doesn't matter at that point, because you just continuously, all you can say is that it's neck and neck, it's very close, because we're relying on those polls. But we have to also see what we're asking polls to do. Yes, whether or not Harris was ahead or Trump was ahead, that, of course, the polls got wrong. They did in 2022 when they predicted a red wave as well. In 2020 also. But the important thing, I think, to note is what the American people were voting on. Those polls were pretty much accurate. For the most part, until election night, when all of a sudden polls came out, notably exit polls, that democracy was on the ballot more than the economy, the polls were telling us it's the economy, it's immigration, it's crime, and it's the safety of the border. And those polls, for the most part, were accurate. But then you would see that most Americans are looking for these issues to be fixed, but then you would see Harris and Trump neck and neck with two completely different visions for America. And I think that's where people started to question whether or not, you know, the polls of them being so tight was accurate or not.
Right. Susan, speaking of these issues, and, you know, it is said that nothing can be fixed overnight. But as per Trump, the Ukraine war can end in 24 hours. We, in fact, started off the show by talking about his claims as far as these wars are concerned. What have you picked up from on the ground about the voters' sentiment regarding these wars, and whether or not that was actually a factor that helped Trump? Because there will be a lot of analysis about what really worked for Trump, what did not work for Harris.
Yeah, I will just really quickly tell you that we're going to listen to all of these complicated analysis, and they're definitely going to come from the Kamala Harris camp, just like they made this election seem very complicated. The election wasn't complicated. The election was basically people sick and tired of being told what to do by celebrities and elites and feeling left out. And every time they stood up to talk, they were told that, you know, they have to be quiet because there are people that know better in Washington, D.C. And Donald Trump was able to connect with those voters, the everyday man, even though the everyday man could have been college graduated, college educated. They don't necessarily have to be those uneducated voters that the Democrats often refer to. So we will hear those complicated analysis, but really it was very simple. These people just were fed up and they wanted a change. They wanted a normal life, go to the grocery store, be able to go on vacation with their families, and not really think about politics so much. But Americans have been thinking of politics for the past 8 years or so, to their disliking. And this brings me to the issue of Ukraine. The issue of America moving towards a more isolationist phase is something that has to be discussed as well. It's not just Trump supporters, but many of the younger generation, they see that a lot of the money and taxpayer dollars is being sent to overseas wars, overseas countries, and it's not really helping everyday Americans here. Now, for the younger generation, the war in Gaza resonated. For other Americans, notably Republicans, they didn't really see Russia as the main enemy. So they were wondering, why is it that the United States is sending so much money to Ukraine? I also want to say those that even supported Ukraine winning were wondering why the Biden administration wasn't sending Ukraine the right weapons so it actually could win the war. So it was sort of like the money was going, but nothing was happening. And I think that resonated with voters. Whether or not Donald Trump is going to be able to solve all the world problems, I mean, I think that's an overstatement, like the polls that we were talking about. But it's going to be different. It's going to be very different from the Biden administration for sure.
Well, if only there was a magic wand to solve the world's problems in 24 hours. We're leaving it there for the moment. Susan, thanks very much for joining us.
To stay up to speed with the latest news, download the WION app and subscribe to our YouTube channel.